Nonlinear animation, take 3. Nonlinear animation in Blender is a very handy tool that allows you to combine different actions into a single animation. So for this, we'll need a 3D view so we can see what we're doing, a timeline, which I'm going to start at frame 0 and end at frame 100, and then minimize because we don't need to see the keyframes on it. Then I'm going to go into corner until I see this crosshair and drag up to get another view, which I will change to a dope sheet. And then I'll split this dope sheet in two and change this to the nonlinear animation view. So instead of the regular dope sheet for the whole scene, I want the action editor to edit individual actions. Now, I'm going to animate this cube, but rather than animate the cube itself, I'm going to use an armature. So I'll add an armature, go to the Object Properties tab, choose Viewport Display, and take in front. So now we can see it more easily. I'm going to select the cube, then the armature, so that this is light orange and this is dark reddish orange. Control P, parent with automatic weights. So now when I move the armature in pose mode, the cube will move with it. Now in object mode, I'm going to move them both up 1 unit so that the cube is right on the floor. Now I'll go into pose mode and I'll keyframe location, rotation, and scale. In this case, I'm only going to be changing location, but I'm doing this just to make a point later on in the video. So up. Now that added an action called armature action. Yeah. And it gave us this option to push down into an NLA track, which we'll need in a bit. But first, I'm going to go to frame 30. I'm going to move the cube up this much, 3 units, add a keyframe there. You can also use auto keying, though I tend to leave it off because I like to be in control. Move this back to the floor, and notice it already added the keyframe. Though I wonder if this keyframe, yes, the keyframe included everything. So auto keying includes location, rotation, and scale, which is something to note. Now that's an animation, which I'm going to change to run at 30 frames per second. Let's make this a little bit more interesting by selecting the middle keyframe and choosing interpolation mode bounce. All right. Excuse me. There we go. So now let's call this track done, but first you should rename it before pushing it down to a track. I'll show you why. So I'll rename it to jump, push it down to an NLA track. You can rename the track itself, but not the NLA strip. Double click it, doesn't do anything. Could I rename it over here? Apparently so. Doesn't rename the action itself. Interesting. Well, I didn't know that. But I don't really want to record the whole video again, so there you go. Learn something new every day. You can't change it by double clicking or pressing F2 or anything, but or in the right click menu, but you can change it over here in the sidebar, which you open by pressing N or dragging right here. No. Right nowhere. Just press, oh, this little tiny arrow right there. But it's hard to get to, so just press N to open it. Select a strip, and then you can choose this strip tab. We'll leave this open because we'll need it later. Let's add a new action. So I'll go to here, say frame 10. Notice how there's no action selected. I'm fairly certain if I add a keyframe. Ah, there it is. It will add a new action for us. Otherwise, we can press new and that will add one. So add a keyframe here, sure. But first, let's try something out. Let's go to this bone tab and notice how the location is keyframed, even though we didn't explicitly change it yet. So that's something to note. I'm going to delete these keyframes. And this time, before I do anything, let's select the action. Okay, I'm confused now. Let's just delete the action then. File, cleanup, unused data blocks. Anyway, go back to your first frame and make sure to mute this track with the tick box. Now we can make a new action and edit it without its keyframes being sort of infected by the movement from by the keyframes of the strip below it, the track below it. This confused me a lot when I was learning this, teaching myself yesterday. So anyway, I'm going to set a keyframe. Go to frame 30. I'm going to rotate 180 degrees around the z-axis and set another keyframe. I'm going to go to frame 50 and rotate another 180 degrees and set another keyframe. And now it spins like so. So there's a little hiccup in the middle. I don't really know what to do about it. I'll think about it later. That's not really the point of the tutorial. So this is spinning. So I'm going to name it spin, and I'm going to push it down to its own track, which I will also name spin. So now we've got two actions, and if I unmute this, then you'll see that it's a little weird. So the first 10 frames, it starts with the jump. Then as soon as spin starts, it jumps back down, because spin actually keyframes location 2. So if you want to combine them, you should select the strip, and for blending, choose combine. And now they're together. Whee! So I'm going to go in edit mode on this object itself and just set one of the sides, just give it a little bevel so we can more easily see which side is which. There we go. So now I'd like to edit the jump to make it feel a little bit better. And also I don't want to wait as long between each cycle, so I'll lower the frame count. So to do that, you can either have to select the armature. There you go. You can either use these little arrow keys, buttons rather, to go between the NLA layers, and notice it becomes green. Or you can select it in here and press tab. That's my preferred way of finding a strip and editing it. Or you can choose it in here, which makes it become orange instead of green, but it still, you know, affects the actual this thing, because it still uses the same action under the hood. So I'm not really sure why the color difference, but anyway, I'm just going to use tab. So I select this, I press tab, I grab these keyframes, I move them back a little. I either unselect this or press tab again. Oppa, now it's edited. Let's go back to the start. Ta-da. As such. What else is there to note? So let's right-click this and split strips. That splits it directly down the middle. I don't think there's a way to change where it's going to split. Would be nice if the 2D time cursor would do that. But anyway, so let's move this over here and this over there, for example. So it spins 180 degrees, and then it spins the last half here. Isn't that cool? So another thing you could do is, for example, that spins 180 degrees. Look at that. So it spins back, and then wait, it jumps back and does it again. So this is, I think it repeats over and over again. Extrapolation, hold forward, only hold last frame. That's perhaps if you change the end frame. Oh no, right, that's if you go after it. Yeah, I'm not really sure what I'm doing. Anyway, swap strips, what that does. Oh, it does exactly what it says it does. Wow. Oh, you actually can't move it past here. Interesting. So you have to use Alt F, or right click swap strips to swap them. So if I want to combine these again, I'll be honest, I don't know how. But what I do know is that I can just delete the whole track, select spin, and push it back down. Set it back to combine, rename it back to spin. There you go, now it's back. That's one way to do it. And last but not least, if you want to combine these tracks into a single action for export to a game engine, you'd go to Object, Animation, Bake Action, or simply press F3 and search for Bake Action. And then I want to bake the pose, not the object. You can also do both if you shift click. I don't want only select the bones. I want all the bones, even though there's only one bones. Moving on from 0 to 60, one step. So there's visual keying and clear constraints. I think you usually use these together. This is relevant if you use constraints like inverse kinematics. But your game engine doesn't support these constraints natively, so you have to bake it into the animation itself. You can do that. So let's bake that, and now we have a new action, which I'll rename to bake. There we go. And I'll push it down to a track. You'll note it looks as though nothing has changed. That's because this is set to replace. So if I set this to combine and go back to the first frame, now it jumps twice as high and spins twice as much, because it's doing both this track and the combination of both tracks. So it's 2 times jump and 2 times spin at the same time. I can move this and split it and such. Get some weird effects going on. Now, I'm just going to set a fake user on this and then remove the track itself entirely, because there's no need to put bake itself, the baked animation, on a track, but I do need to keep it around if I wanted to export it. So there you go. And then it's pretty interesting that you don't see these keyframes in the timeline or the dope sheet or anything. You only see them in the nonlinear animation editor, which can be quite nice for keeping your timeline and your animation organized. That's quite interesting. Let me think if I missed anything of importance. Sorry for the lack of structure. I'll get it one day. Constraints. Yes, I wanted to test something with constraints. So let's go to pose mode, pick a bone, bone constraints. Let's choose, say, limit distance. And then let's add an empty plane axis. Why not? Set this to in front as well. And then put it like over here. And choose this limit distance to the empty to 1 meter. So now, you know, that's weird, of course. 2 meters. So now it's staying within that radius of the empty. Very interesting stuff. So let's select this bake and do that, remove it. Now for some reason, it says it still has a user. It doesn't have a 0 next to it. So to remove it, I just go to the Blender file, Actions, Bake, and delete. Then go back to the view layer over here. And now it's gone. Whatever was using it, I don't care. It's gone. Oh, interesting thing. You can see actions for every object in your scene, including ones that don't even have any animation. So you can turn that off with this, and then it'll just show selected objects. This says include missing NLA. And you also have only show selected, and then it will still show the this thing. which I don't particularly need either. Okay, so if you untick this, then the empty would still be visible if it had animation. So if I add a keyframe, now it's still visible as an empty action. Or it's called an empty, so the action happens to be called empty action. But you can also show only selected to be sure, and now even if the keyframe has, or if the empty has any actions, they still won't show up unless you select the empty. So that can be preferred. Anyway, constraints. So that's cool. Now let's try baking this action again. Let's try doing it without the constraints. So now we've got this new action. And it works fine. And if I hide this constraint, then you see that it's not actually baked into these keyframes. The constraint is still live. So let's undo until this baked action is gone. If you wanted to have it baked into the action itself, the constraints, in case your game engine, for example, source engine, oh boy, doesn't support constraints natively, then you should use visual keying. Set that at 60, choose pose, oppa. So now, when I hide the constraint, it's in there. And you can also choose clear constraints if you want to remove the actual constraints themselves. But it depends on what type of constraint it is, whether you would want to do that. Because in this case, it's not hurting anything having it stacked on top of each other. Basically, having it baked into these keyframes and also still live over here doesn't affect anything because it's a limit distance. But a copy location might behave differently, you know? So you might want to, at that point, choose to bake and clear constraints. Oppa. Now the constraint itself is removed, but it is baked into this action. And then if I push this down and I rename this to baked, or just bake, I guess. I don't know. The action seems to still be called action over here.
Get baked, dummy.
There we go. So many places to rename the same thing. Now when I mute this track, you'll note that the constraint, because it was removed here, doesn't affect these previous strips. And also if I set this to combine instead of replace, it it gets all funky about it because it's 2 times the same thing-ish. It's got this one, it's got that one, it's got that one. Wow. So that is my understanding of actions and nonlinear animation in Blender from what I've taught myself yesterday. Hope it helps.